You know, there comes a point when someone who always kept their distance suddenly realizes the silence feels heavier than your presence ever did. The person who once seemed so composed, so detached, begins to feel something they never expected: the emptiness of losing someone who truly cared. You see, avoidant people often think love is something they can control. They believe that by keeping you at arm's length, they can protect their heart from pain, but in doing so, they often end up protecting themselves from love itself. When you walked away not out of anger, but out of quiet strength, something shifted. They didn't expect you to stop chasing. They didn't expect your warmth to fade. They thought you'd always be there, waiting, hoping they'd come around. But when the day came that you finally chose peace over confusion, their illusion cracked, and for the first time, they realized they weren't the ones in control anymore. Avoidants don't lose you the day you walk out. They lose you the moment they notice that your world didn't collapse without them. When they see you smiling, growing, loving again, not in bitterness, but in freedom, that's when it hits them. Because for someone who fears closeness, watching you move on with grace becomes a haunting reminder of what they pushed away. But here's the truth. Your worth was never defined by their ability to recognize it. You were already whole, you were already enough. It just took distance for them to see what they took for granted. The moment they realize they've lost you is also the moment they confront their own fears, not of losing you, but of facing themselves. Because now they can't blame love for their pain. They have to look in the mirror and see the pattern that cost them something real. So if you've ever loved someone avoidant, and you're wondering whether they'll ever realize what they had, yes, they will. But by the time they do, you'll have already stepped into a version of yourself that no longer needs their validation. You'll see that their distance wasn't a rejection of your worth, it was a reflection of their own fear. And while they wrestle with regret, you'll be building something far greater: peace, clarity, and self-love. The moment they realize they lost you is powerful, not because it proves your value, but because it marks the beginning of your freedom. You didn't lose them, you found yourself, and that, my friend, is the most beautiful ending of all. When an avoidant person begins to realize what they've lost, it doesn't happen in an instant. It creeps in slowly, like the quiet echo of a familiar voice that no longer answers. At first, they might convince themselves they're fine. They'll fill their days with distractions, convince themselves that space is what they needed all along, that distance means freedom. But eventually, silence becomes heavy. What once felt like control starts to feel like loneliness. The absence of your energy, your warmth, and your effort becomes unmistakable. They start to notice how the conversations that used to bring life into their day are gone. The little gestures of care, the reassurance, the presence that made them feel safe without admitting it, all of it has faded. And for someone who spent so long avoiding closeness, that emptiness becomes their mirror. Distance has a strange way of revealing truth. When you were near, they couldn't see clearly. They were too busy defending their space, building emotional walls, fearing the loss of independence. But once you step away, the noise quiets down, and they begin to notice the value of what they dismissed. They realize that your consistency wasn't pressure, it was love. That your patience wasn't weakness, it was understanding. They begin to see how much life you brought into their world and how empty it feels without it. The moments that once felt overwhelming now feel precious. The silence that once brought comfort now echoes with regret. For you, this shift is empowering, because for the longest time you might have questioned your worth. You might have felt like your love wasn't enough, or that your effort was too much. But now, as distance reveals truth, you start to see that it was never about your value. It was about their readiness. The space between you shows that what you offered was real, and that your presence carried meaning. Their realization isn't about them suddenly seeing your worth, it's about them finally feeling the loss of what they couldn't handle. When they notice you moving forward, smiling again, choosing peace, they begin to understand the cost of their avoidance. They see that your life didn't fall apart without them, it blossomed. That awareness cuts deep because for someone who feared being needed, they now face the pain of being forgotten. Distance doesn't just separate two people, it exposes truth. And the truth is, the one who avoids closeness eventually learns that love cannot exist without vulnerability. The space they created to feel safe becomes the very thing that teaches them what they lost. You don't need to prove anything. The silence does it for you. Distance becomes the language of realization, a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest lesson for the avoidant is not in what they gained by leaving, but in what they lost by staying distant. And in that quiet recognition, your absence becomes their awakening. Avoidant individuals often believe that by maintaining control, they can protect themselves from the pain that love might bring. They think distance equals safety, that if they stay guarded, they won't get hurt. For a while, this illusion feels comforting. They convince themselves they're fine without closeness, that needing someone is a weakness, and that emotional independence is strength. But the truth is, control built on fear is fragile. It can only hold up as long as the other person keeps trying. Once you stop reaching out, once you no longer chase, that illusion begins to crumble. The silence that follows becomes louder than any words could be. It forces them to see that what they thought was safety has actually become isolation. When you were in their life, they had the privilege of your patience. You showed up even when they pulled back. You reassured them when they doubted. You stayed when they tested your love. But when you finally step back, not out of anger, but self-respect, they feel a shift they never expected. They begin to realize they're no longer the one setting the pace. The power they once held, the ability to decide when to connect and when to withdraw, starts to fade. They no longer have control over the rhythm of your relationship because you've stopped dancing to their tune. The control they valued so deeply becomes meaningless once you choose peace over pursuit. At first, they might mistake your silence for another phase, something temporary, something you'll come back from. But as time passes and you don't return, reality begins to set in. They look for signs of you, your messages, your care, your warmth, and they find none. The absence becomes undeniable. That's when regret seeps in. It's not just about missing you. It's about realizing they were never truly in control. They see now that love can't be managed or measured. You can't keep someone close while constantly pushing them away. They thought they could dictate the flow, but in trying to avoid pain, they created it. This realization is painful for them because it dismantles their sense of security. The very walls they built for protection became barriers against love. Now, they're left alone with the understanding that control didn't save them, it cost them something irreplaceable. The regret that follows isn't just about losing you, it's about facing the truth that they had something real and let it slip away out of fear. They start to question why they needed to hold back, why vulnerability felt so dangerous, and why the person who loved them most is now the one they can't reach. Meanwhile, you've reclaimed your power. You've stopped waiting for them to show up and started showing up for yourself. Their regret becomes a lesson, not a victory, because true strength isn't in controlling love, it's in being brave enough to feel it fully. And the avoidant only learns this once control turns to regret. There comes a moment when you finally realize that your worth was never dependent on someone else's ability to see it. For so long, you might have been caught in a cycle of trying to prove your value, showing love, patience, and understanding, hoping they'd finally recognize what you brought into their life. But an avoidant person often struggles to receive love deeply. They mistake affection for pressure, care for control, and vulnerability for danger. So even though you offered them something genuine, they couldn't fully take it in. They weren't rejecting you. They were rejecting the intimacy that terrified them. Yet when they lose you, when the noise quiets and they are left with the echo of your absence, something within them shifts. They start to see that what they once dismissed was irreplaceable. The irony is that they often realize your value when you've already stopped seeking their validation. When you stop fighting to be seen, you step back into your own light. You remember that love doesn't have to be earned, it flows naturally from who you are. Their recognition might come eventually, but by then you'll see it for what it is, a reflection of their awakening, not a confirmation of your worth, because true confidence isn't found in someone finally saying, "I see your value." It's found in knowing that you never needed them to say it. You were whole even when they couldn't recognize it. For the avoidant, this realization carries weight. They start to understand that your patience wasn't desperation, it was love, that your openness wasn't weakness, it was strength. When they lose access to that energy, they feel the difference. The relationships they turn to afterward might lack depth or consistency. They start to notice how rare it was to be understood without judgment, to be cared for without conditions. But that understanding comes too late, because the version of you that needed their approval no longer exists. You've grown beyond the need for reassurance. You've discovered that someone's inability to love you properly has nothing to do with your capacity to love deeply. This is the shift from seeking validation to embodying self-worth. When they finally see what they lost, it's not because you changed, it's because they did. They've begun to see through the lens of loss, while you've begun to live through the lens of self-respect. The dynamic flips, where once you sought their attention, now they seek your presence. Where once you measured your worth by their affection, now you understand that your value never depended on their readiness to love. Their recognition may feel satisfying for a moment, but it's not what defines you. What truly matters is that you no longer need it. You've learned that love that cannot meet you at your level of openness will only hold you back. Their delayed awareness becomes their lesson and your liberation. When you finally step back from someone who could never fully meet you emotionally, something powerful happens. Your healing begins to take priority over their recognition. For so long, you might have been waiting for an apology, an explanation, or a moment of realization where they finally understand the pain their distance caused. But healing doesn't come from their regret. It comes from your decision to stop waiting for it. When you choose to focus on yourself instead of the person who couldn't love you properly, you start to reclaim your peace. The energy that once went into trying to make them stay begins to flow back into you. You start sleeping better, breathing easier, and realizing that closure doesn't always arrive in the form of words. Sometimes it's the quiet understanding that you deserved better. For the avoidant, regret is a slow burn. They don't often realize what they've lost immediately. It creeps in gradually in the moments when they notice you're no longer available, when they see you no longer trying to bridge the gap. They may replay old memories, wondering why they pulled away when all you offered was care. But while they're wrestling with confusion and guilt, you're already on a different path, one that leads toward freedom. Because once you detach from needing their validation, you begin to see things clearly. You understand that their behavior was never a reflection of your worth, but of their fear. Healing in this context isn't about forgetting them. It's about forgiving yourself for staying too long, for explaining too much, for loving someone who wasn't ready. It's the realization that you don't need them to come back and make sense of it all. You've already made sense of it on your own. You recognize that the person who couldn't give you consistency wasn't withholding love out of cruelty, but out of fear of vulnerability. And while that understanding brings compassion, it also brings closure. Because you finally see that it was never your job to heal their wounds at the expense of your own. Their regret might surface when they see you moving on with grace, not bitter, not broken, but at peace. It's in those moments they realize what they had was rare, but by then, your healing has taken you too far to look back. You no longer crave their acknowledgement because your growth has given you something far more valuable: perspective. You've turned pain into wisdom. You've learned that some people can only love you to the depth of their self-awareness, and that their inability to meet you there isn't your failure. While they sit in the discomfort of their regret, you rise in the light of your healing. Their silence no longer feels like rejection. It feels like confirmation that walking away was the right choice. You've found peace not in their words, but in your own strength, and that is the truest form of closure there is. Freedom doesn't always arrive with a grand moment of realization sometimes. It comes quietly, in the peace you feel when you stop trying to fix what was never yours to heal. When you finally step away from someone who couldn't meet you emotionally, you begin to see that the real victory isn't in them realizing what they lost, but in you realizing what you gained. The moment you stopped chasing their love was the moment you started reclaiming your own. You no longer needed their attention, their validation, or their half-hearted efforts to feel whole. You began to rebuild your life around your own energy instead of waiting for theirs. That's when true freedom begins, not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of self-respect. The avoidance realization often comes too late. They may look back and finally understand the depth of what they had, but by then, you've outgrown the version of yourself that needed them to stay. While they sit in the discomfort of regret, you stand in the strength of release. You see that love isn't about convincing someone to choose you, it's about choosing yourself when they won't. The power you once gave away, the constant explaining, the hoping, the waiting returns to you in the form of clarity. You understand now that love without emotional presence isn't love at all. It's a longing dressed as connection. Freedom shows up when you start finding joy in your own company again. When your mornings are lighter, your thoughts quieter, your heart steadier. You stop replaying the moments that hurt and start building new ones that heal. You realize that closure was never theirs to give, it was a choice you could make the moment you stopped needing answers. Because the truth is, some people can only love you from a distance, not because you were unworthy, but because closeness threatens the armor they've spent years building. And while that may be their journey to face, it's not your responsibility to walk it with them. The beauty of your transformation lies in how softly you let go. You don't need to hate them. You don't need to prove anything. You simply rise wiser, more grounded in your truth. And as they begin to understand the weight of their choices, you've already turned the page. What they experience as loss, you experience as liberation. The love you once gave to them now flows back into you, creating space for deeper, healthier connections, not just with others, but with yourself. When they realize they lost you, it may sting. But when you realize you found yourself, it heals. That is the ultimate freedom, knowing that you no longer have to shrink to fit into someone else's fears. You are no longer bound by what they couldn't give. You've stepped into a version of love that starts within, and from there, everything beautiful begins to grow. In the end, this journey isn't about who realized what too late, it's about the strength it takes to walk away, to choose peace over confusion, and to find yourself in the silence left behind. When love teaches you through loss, it also guides you back to your worth, reminding you that every ending is just the beginning of a stronger, freer you. Thank you all for listening, for showing up for your own healing, and for believing that even after heartbreak, there is always hope, growth, and a more powerful version of love waiting within you.